Hi, I'm Anna, and welcome back to this new weekly Torah video in the channel Jóvenes Peregrinando. In today's video, we are going to be analyzing and studying chapters 12 and 13 to verse 16 of Exodus. And today's video is titled, Covered by Yeshúa or Judged as Sons of Pharaoh. But before we begin with today's chapters, let's remember what we saw in the previous chapters, where we learned about the plagues that the Eternal Father sent to the land of Egypt, and that these plagues demonstrated to the Egyptians the lack of power that their gods had. We also saw that Elohim was the only one who has all the power in the land or in the world. We also saw that the Eternal had a purpose with these plagues, which was to extend his fame among the nations. In today's chapters, we will learn about the festivity of Pesach, Matzot, and about the consecration of the firstborn. With this short introduction, let's start with today's video. Starting off with verses 1 and 2 of chapter 12, it says, The Eternal said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, This month will be the first month for you, the first month of the year. In this chapter 12, we are going to be looking at the Pesach festivity, known within the religions or within the Bible as the Passover, where we are going to be seeing that the prophetic meaning of this festivity has to do with Yeshua's sacrifice. In these verses, we read that the Eternal tells the Israelites that the month of Aviv was going to be the first month of the Hebrew year for the Israelites. It is important to mention that this is not considered as a new year for them, since the scriptures do not mention it. Within the Jewish context, the tradition says that the Torah began from here, because from here the Eternal ordered the people a commandment that has to do with their faith and how they were going to serve him. Let's remember that the purpose for which the people were going to leave Egypt was so they could serve their Creator in freedom, without any slavery. This commandment had to do with the annual cycle, which he established, and it also had to do with the fruit of the barley, which is ripening to be harvested. That is why the month of Aviv was established as the first month of the year. It is important that as believers, we know how the Hebrew calendar works, a very different calendar from the Jewish calendar, apart from the fact that the Jewish calendar has festivities that are not biblical. In other words, they are not established or they are not given by the Eternal. The Hebrew calendar is based on the movement of the moon. That is to say, that when a new moon begins, so does a new month. And this is how the biblical Hebrew calendar is followed till this day. After the time of the Messiah, passing a few centuries, a pope named Gregory came, who imposed the Gregorian calendar, which till this day is being used, who imposed its dates, years, months, and even some emperors changed the names of the months. These months were named July, which was named after the Emperor Julio Caesar, and August, which was named after the Emperor Augustus. They also published their own pagan festivities, such as Christmas, New Year's, the Day of Love and Friendship, which people commonly celebrated, and it is known as Valentine's Day. And well, as we know, all these dates are pure paganism, worship to their gods, and the people celebrated these festivities people celebrate till now these festivities without knowing their true meaning. The Eternal gave us a calendar that appears in the Torah with lunar months and holidays that are not only of service to him, but these festivities are also prophetic and are talking about the Messiah. Each holy appointment has a prophetic figure, which Yeshua came fulfilling in his time, or that he still has yet to fulfill. An important event that happened on the first day of the first month of the second year of leaving Egypt was the rise of the Mishkan, known as the sanctuary, where it was raised in the middle of the desert, where the presence of the Eternal dwelt in a cloud in the middle of the people. In the verses, in the indicated verses where it narrates the rise of or the construction of the Mishkan, we can read that it speaks of the construction of a true sanctuary. We know that we are a sanctuary and that we are building a spiritual building. As believers, it is important to recognize the moment when the divine presence descended on and in the midst of the people. In the Mishkan, that is why the first day of the first month of the year is a special day, remembering the construction of the sanctuary, and also remembering also celebrating it in memory of Yeshua's Korban. Continuing with verses 3 to 8, it says, "Tell the whole community of Israel that the 10th day of this month each man is to take a lamp for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamp, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamp needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old mates without defect, and you may take them from the sheep and the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, among with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast." In these verses, we begin to see the instructions regarding what was going to be done that day of the festivity of Pesach, which was going to bring with it the freedom of the people. In the first month of the year, each family was going to take a lamp. This lamp had to be a male without any defect, and they would have to observe it from the 10th day till the 14th day. Something that the tradition says is that they would take the lamp and bring it closer to the family. It is believed that they would tie up his legs and put it in a place inside the house and keep it until the 14th day. And in the indicated time, the family was going to sacrifice it to the Eternal. This act was a miracle, since in Egypt it was forbidden to kill the lambs because they worshipped them. The lamp within the scriptures had a purpose, which was to redeem. In Hebrew, lamp is kaporet, and it means cover. The importance of the lamp was to give freedom to the people, but this freedom was not for them to live their lives however they wanted, but it was a freedom so they could serve the Eternal without any kind of slavery or without any kind of oppression from any person. Also, the lamp was a medium between the Creator and the people. Just as the people had its own medium, we today also have it. It is Yeshúa, who by his sacrifice is now medium for humanity towards the Father. In verse 4, we read that it says that if the lamp was too much for one family, then they would have to share the lamp with another family, and thus both families would be under the same covering of the blood. In verse 6, it mentions that they had to sacrifice the lamb between the 2 evenings of the 14th day of the first month of Aviv. The Hebrew day was separated between the 2 afternoons of 2 days. That is to say that there were 2 watches. It began from 12 to 3. That was considered the first afternoon, or the first watch, and from 6 to 3 it was considered as the second afternoon or as the second watch. But everything depended on the count or the time they were in, since there were several watches. So when the scripture says that the lamb had to be slaughtered between the 2 afternoons, it was referring to the middle of both afternoons, which is from 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. So it is more certain that they did it around 3 p.m. One of the important things that happens when Yeshua comes to fulfill this festivity is that Yeshua dies just when the Eternal said to the people that the Israelites should be sacrificed when they were in Egypt between the 2 afternoons. That same hour, Yeshua also died. He gave himself up as an unleavened bread, that is, as a body without sin. And later on, we're going to see more about this festivity of 7 days, or as it's called in Hebrew, as this festivity of Matzot. In the resurrection of Yeshua, we can see that it has to do with the first fruits that were the first fruits in that same month. That is to say that Yeshua prophetically fulfills this first commandment that has to do with Pesach and unleavened bread. And this festivity that he fulfills in Hebrew, it is called the festivity of Bikurim. In verse 8, we see that it is mentioned about the bitter herbs, which prophetically signify the affliction of Yeshua. These commandments that were given in Egypt were going to become the spring festivities, which brought with them, apart from the service, a prophetic hope, both for the people and for us today. As it has already been mentioned, each festivity has a prophetic meaning, and that Yeshua is in his coming came to fulfill. For example, the festivity of Pesach, where he fulfilled it by being the perfect lamb who gave up his life so that anyone who wanted or who wants to seek salvation can seek it. Bikurim, as we mentioned, where he fulfills it in the resurrection of Yeshua, and in the festivity of Shavuot, where he fulfills it when he returns to heaven and he sends the Ruach, or the Ruach HaKodesh, which is the Spirit of holiness, to his disciples. But something curious that we see in the New Testament is that the autumn festivities are not mentioned. These autumn festivities are Yom Teruah, which is the day of sounding the shofar, Yom HaKippurim, the day of atonement, and the festivity of Sukkot, which is the festival of the cabins. This means that Yeshua possibly will fulfill these festivities prophetically in his second coming, since we believe that his second coming may be on Yom Teruah. In verse 8, it says that they will eat the meat roasted over the fire. This also has a prophetic meaning. When it says roasted over the fire, it means that the judgment would pass over the Messiah's flesh. The fire always alludes to judgment, a purification of fire. And this had to happen because in him the judgment was going to be poured out. He was going to bear all the sin of Israel and of us. That is to say, all the sinful condition of Adam that we inherited spiritually was going to be cleansed through the blood of the Lamb. That is why the fire had to pass over him, because he was that perfect lamb. Continuing with verses 9 through 13, it says, or 9 through 14, it says, "Do not eat the raw meat or boiled in water, but roast it over the fire with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it till morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you're going to eat it: with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is Adonai's Pesach. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Almighty. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This is a day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Eternal, a lasting ordinance." In verse 9, it says that the people could not eat the meat raw nor boiled, but roasted on the fire. As we mentioned in verse 8, this act had to do with a prophetic meaning. Everything had to be consumed, because in Yeshua's sacrifice, we can see that it had to be a sacrifice it had to be totally complete. That being said, nothing had to be left over. Everything had to be consumed, and that is why the Eternal tells the people that everything had to be eaten or had to be consumed, and if anything was left, and if anything was left over, then it had to be done so that way, or it had to be burnt so that way everything could be finished. Just as we read here that the people had to be ready to leave Egypt as soon as the signal was given, this can mean a lot to us, because when we want to enter the faith of the Messiah, we must be ready and firm to leave Egypt, to leave from the slavery of this world. Because when we are within the faith of Yeshua, we cannot also be within the world. That is, we cannot be tepid. In verse 12, when the Eternal says that he was going to pass through Egypt and kill every firstborn who did not have the blood of the Lamb on their door frames of their houses, it does not mean that the Eternal himself was going to pass between them, but that the Eternal was going to send his angel to pass through Egypt in order to do justice to the gods of the Egyptians. In verse 13, it mentions that the Eternal told the people that when the angel of the death passed among them, there would be no death between them, as long as they had put the blood on the door frames. As we see, the blood of the lamb was going to be used to be put in the door frames of the houses of the Israelites, so that when the angel of death passed among them, there would be no firstborn dead. Just as the blood of the lamb was going to liberate them from death, so too the blood of the Messiah is the one that covers us, protects us, cleanses us, cleanses us from sin, and makes us spiritually clean. But the physical cleaning is our duty to do. That is why we have the Torah, and through the Torah is that we can do this physical cleaning. And here we also see the importance of the Torah. An important fact that must be known is that the blood was not and is not allowed to be eaten or to be consumed, because in blood there is life. It is important to understand that while we are under the covering of Yeshua through his blood, we must remain obedient to the Father through the Torah. Because we cannot say that we are covered by the blood of Yeshua if we are not in obedience. Yeshua himself says in Matthew 7, verse 22 and 23. On that day many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Continuing with verses 15 through 20, it says, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove you should remove the yeast out of your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall hold a holy assembly, and on the 7th day a holy assembly. No work shall be done on those days, but what everyone needs to eat, that alone may be prepared by you. And you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For on this very day I brought your host out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. In the first month from the 14th day of the month at evening you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven is to be found in your houses. If anyone eats what is leavened, that person will be cut off from the consecration of Israel, whether he is a foreigner or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwelling places you shall eat unleavened bread. In these verses, we see that it narrates about the festival or about the festivity of unleavened bread. In Hebrew, it is called matzot, where the Eternal orders that 7 days unleavened bread would be eaten or shall be eaten. All these instructions that the Eternal gives to Moses are not just for the people, but also for today's believers. In detail, these verses explain that from the first day, the yeast had to disappear from their houses. The Eternal also orders that on the first day and on the 7th day, a holy convocation had to be made, called festive Shabbat. They are days of rest where no work will be done except what each one has to eat. These days are to be dedicated to celebrating and exalting the Eternal, and nowadays it also has to be like that. It has to be a festive Shabbat where we do not work and we just dedicate that time to celebrating and exalting the Eternal. In verse 18, it is specified that on the 14th day at the evening, unleavened bread was going to be eaten because that day the Pesach memorial was going to take place, because immediately the 15th day began, which is the first day of Matzot. The 7 days of unleavened bread began, where unleavened bread was going to be eaten until the evening of the 21st day of the month. That is why in the special Pesach dinner we accompany the lamb with bitter herbs and unleavened bread, because in this portion of the Torah it is said that from the 14th day nothing leavened was going to be eaten. Unleavened bread was not going to be eaten in the whole house, and of course, to celebrate the reminder or the memorial and the 7 days of Matzot, it is necessary to live a life without sin, without lies, and without hypocrisy, just as Yeshua the Messiah lived his life. Something important that the commandment orders is to search even in the last corner of our houses, but also in our minds and in our hearts. That way we could remove all yeast and thus be cleaned before the Eternal. This holy appointment is called a feast because it is an offering of our lives to the Father. Matzot, which means unleavened bread, was instituted because when the Israelites leave Egypt, they do it so quickly that their breads are made in a hurry because there is no time to leaven the dough, and so they take time to eat during the days they walk on the desert. The Bible teaches us that it was in Egypt where yeast was made, and that it symbolizes falsehood and hypocrisy, which appears to be what it is not. A leavened bread is full of air, and it appears bigness, but it doesn't have it. The Eternal then teaches us in these days, in these days of Matzot, that we must leave the world quickly, and that we must be like unleavened bread in this world. That is to say, we must be like believers who do not pretend and are not liars, that we do not act, but that we are true to what we say we believe in. The Eternal warns the people that those who do not comply with the Eternal's instructions, then they would be cut off from Israel. Since not removing yeast from the house and not eating matzat, unleavened bread, on these days represents as it represents as a violation of the commandment, and therefore it is considered as rebellion. As it had already been mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, Yeshua in his life fulfilled this prophetic shadow because he lived like unleavened bread. There was no lie or cheat in him, and this also helps us as believers in the Messiah or in the faith of the Messiah, how we should live a life like he lived his life. In these verses, we see that the number 7 is mentioned a lot. 7 within the scriptures has a meaning which means something perfect. This teaches us that although we leave the yeast for 7 days, we must be perfect in our lives all the time, and not just in these 7 days of matzot, being like an unleavened bread. Never letting our dough rise, that is to say, we do not let our flesh be in sin. We do not let our carnal desires take over us. If we already left the Egypt of sin, we have already left the yeast there. Once we are cleansed by Yeshua, then we must remain as he remained, in truth and in obedience to the Eternal. In verses 21 to 28, Moses goes and repeats the instructions to the people so that they will diligently comply with them and teach them to the generations to come. Continuing with verses 30 through 36, it says, "And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he told Moses and Aaron by night and said, Up, up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go serve the Eternal, as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we shall all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. and the Eternal had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. The attitude of Pharaoh had been quite arrogant and exalted. These things the Eternal allowed them to happen so he could act with a strong, powerful, and miraculous hand on the oppression that the Pharaoh had put on his people. The death of the firstborn had to happen in order to bend the pride, the malice, and the ego of the Pharaoh, and thus let the Israelites leave Egypt to serve the Eternal in the correct way as he had commanded. The Eternal also gave grace to the Israelites so that they would give them gold or so the Egyptians would give the Israelites gold and silver in such a way as long as they left immediately, because seeing the greatness of their Almighty or of their Elohim of Israel's Elohim, the Egyptians feared for their lives. And something curious is that these goods that the Egyptians gave to the Israelites later on these things would be an offering for the decoration of the Mishkan or of the sanctuary, and this we'll be able to see in later on in the chapters of Exodus. Continuing with verses 37 and 38, it says, And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. In these verses, we can read that it speaks of a figure of more or less than 600,000 men, not counting women, children, the elderly, and the Egyptians who went out with them. So it is believed that approximately the number can be quadruplated, and there could have been about 2.5 million people, including all the groups mentioned above. And here, once again, we see the wonders of the Eternal when he fulfills the promise that he made to Abraham when he told him that his offspring would be innumerable. Continuing with verse 39, it says, And they baked unleavened cakes and they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt, and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. In these verses, we see one more aspect about the matzah, and at the same time, it is another judgment towards the Egyptian gods. The origin of yeast is attributed to the Egyptians, since the Egyptians believed that the chemical reaction that produced fermentation was actually a miracle of their gods towards them. In fact, bread, in addition to being a simple food, they also used it as a payment for their workers, or for their field workers. A leavened bread was worth more than a flat bread. In the Egyptian mythology, Renanute is a cobra goddess of food, fertility, harvest, and guardian of the Pharaoh. She was the goddess of barns, crops, and food, being the mother of the grain god Nepri. Egyptian agriculture was closely linked to the Nile, depending on a mighty river for a fertile land and a bountiful harvest. The importance of a good harvest in ancient Egypt led the Egyptians to make numerous sacrifices to their goddess during that time. For this reason, the Matzah could be related, as in the case of the plagues, a judgment towards the Egyptian gods, who once again were ridiculed before the power of the Almighty, Elohim of Israel. That is why it is important that as believers, every time we celebrate the eternal feast by eating matzot, we remember that we are reaffirming the judgment of the gods of slavery, minimizing their power and declaring the power of the Eternal, who is the only capable of sustenance, who is the only capable of sustaining his people. Continuing with verse 41, it's 40 through 41, it says, "The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Eternal went out from the land of Egypt." This is one more prophecy that was fulfilled, just as the Eternal Almighty told Abraham, which we find in Genesis 15, verse 12 and through 14, that says, "As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Eternal said to Abram, 'Know for certain that your offspring will be foreigners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions.'" The Judaism for the rebellion they have against the Messiah, they assure that the account, or that the number of the 430 years includes from Abraham to Moses. So they assure that the years of slavery in Egypt for the people were only 215 years. But this is a wrong fact, because both in Genesis and in this verse of Exodus, it clearly says that they were going to be slaves for 430 years. What happens is that they do not want to see the coming of the Messiah or accept the coming of the Messiah, and that is why they oppose the biblical account. In these verses, we see that they leave the same day they arrived with Joseph to live in Egypt. And that same day, the Almighty gives them the freedom so they could serve him. In verses 42 through 45, it says, It was a night of watching by the Eternal to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Eternal by all the people of Israel throughout their generations. And the Eternal said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. No foreigner or hired worker may eat of it." An important mandate that till this day must be taken care of is to celebrate the Pesach meal, or the Pesach dinner, and be on watch all the night in the name of the Creator, to exalt him, because both the Israelites and the people added by the Messiah have been given freedom over the oppressors, over Pharaoh and the adversary, who become oppressors of the souls. In these verses, we see prohibitions of who should and who should not eat the Passover. We can find two differences about the word foreigner in Hebrew. The first word is nekar, which means an unaffiliated foreigner. someone who is only passing through without responsibilities towards the town or towards the people. The second word is Hertusha, who is a foreigner, close or upstart, who wants to be part of the people and converts to the people. Another status of is of the slave who is part of the family and has to do the Brit Milah, known as the court pact, or as the cut pact. And they would do this, the slaves would do this in order to be part of the people. Now, in the Messiah, the Brit, or the covenant that is made is by cutting the heart, not physically, but spiritually. And this we do it by removing from our lives the pagan and the carnal desires that may want to overcome us, or that may want to control us. If we wish to come and to be a part of the Messiah's people and take the Passover or the Pesach meal, it must be done with a commitment not to return to the old life of sin, but to remain in holiness, obedience, and observance of the Torah. Verse 46 says, "It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house, and you shall not break any of its bones." In this verse, we can see that we can see that it is mentioned that the bones should not be broken. And here we can see one more prophecy that is being mentioned about the Messiah, about the Messiah, of that perfect lamb who would have to fulfill the role of the lamb of liberation, which the Messiah fulfilled, and that in his sacrifice we saw that not one of his bones were broken, and this was actually the prophecy that Yeshúa came to fulfill in his sacrifice. And this prophecy, we can see it being fulfilled when we read it in the letter of John chapter 19 verse 31 through 33, that says, "Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the stick, or on the stick of wood, on the Shabbos, for the Shabbos was a high day. The Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, or that their legs should be broken, and that they should be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the second one who had been sacrificed, or who had been also killed along with Yeshúa. But when they came to Yeshúa and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Here, or in the sacrifice of the Messiah, it was prophetically fulfilled, just as it was written here in the book of Exodus, that the bones of the meat of the lamb could not be broken. And here in the sacrifice of Yeshúa, we read in these verses of the letter of John, we can read that Yeshua's bones, when the Jews ordained the soldiers to break the bones of the people that had been that were killed by the Jews. We can see here that when they ordained the soldiers to do this, they saw Yeshúa and they saw him that he was dead already, and therefore they did not break his bones. In verses 47 to 51, the requirements about foreigners and slaves are repeated, and it is also repeated how circumcision now counts to participate in the Pesach memorial. And this is what we see in the last verses of chapter 12. And continuing with chapter 13, verses 1 verses 1 to 5, it says, "The Eternal said to Moses, Consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both man and of beast, is mine." Then Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you come out from Egypt, out of the house of slavery, for by a strong hand the Eternal brought you out from this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. Today in the month of Aviv you are going out, and when the Eternal brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this service in his month." The Eternal's intention was initially to consecrate the firstborn in each family, because at no time did he plan for the people to spend 40 years wandering in the desert, nor for a single tribe to be the one in charge of presenting the people before him. The Eternal's desire was that the people walk straight to the promised land, and that each firstborn be a faithful minister before the service. But because of the hardness of the heart of the Israelites, and that is not at all different from the hearts of the people today, because of the sin of the golden calf, or of the golden cow, because of their refusal to receive the Torah directly from the Eternal, in each life they had to live a very negative consequences according to their actions. But here in these verses we are witnessing the fidelity and kindness that the Eternal or that the Creator has for the humanity, and also a reminder to observe the moon month by month, so they could distinguish the month of Aviv and keep in this way the commandment, and even more when they possessed the promised land by inheritance. Continuing with verses 6 through 10, it says, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a feast to the Eternal. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen with you, and no leaven shall be seen with you in all your territory. You shall tell your son that day, it is because of what the Eternal did for me when I came out of Egypt, and it shall be to you as a sign on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the law of the Eternal may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Eternal has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this statute as its appointed time from year to year. Here the Eternal commands that year after year the festival of Pesach and Matzot should be remembered and celebrated again. Since the Eternal commands that it was the parents' duty to teach their children why these holidays were celebrated, and thus the children could learn to obey his command, or this commandment of the Eternal, and also so that this festivity of Matzah and Pesach could be celebrated and could be a holy appointment for them from generation to generation. When the Eternal Father gives the commandments to Moses, he includes the holy convocations, and when the Eternal repeats the words to Moses, he mentions them again. He mentions one more time this feast of unleavened bread to be celebrated. This we can find it in Leviticus 23 verses 6 through 8 and in Deuteronomy chapter 16 verses 3 and 4. Continuing with the last verses of this chapter 13, it says, "When the Eternal brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and shall give it to you, you shall set apart to the Eternal all that first opens the womb, all the firstborn of your animals that are males shall be the Eternal's. Every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, or if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. Every firstborn of men among your sons you shall redeem. And when in time to come your son asks you, what does this mean? You shall say to him, by a strong hand the Eternal brought us out of Egypt, from the house of slavery. For when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Eternal killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of men and the firstborn of animals. Therefore I sacrifice to the Eternal all the males that first opened the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. It shall be as a mark on your hand or on the forehead between your eyes. For by a strong hand the Eternal brought us out of Egypt." In these verses we see that the donkey is mentioned, and the donkey was an important animal for the Israelites, as it represented help at work for them, since it was a carry animal. But because it was not a kosher animal, it was not acceptable for the service or for a sacrifice or an offering to the Creator. So that is why it says in these verses that it had to be replaced by a kosher animal, and this kosher animal was the lamb, which was considered a cleaned animal. In this group of verses, we once again see the commandment to remind the next generations of the mighty miracles with which the Creator made or let them free from bondage or from the slavery or the oppression that the Pharaoh of Egypt had towards them. In verse 16, when it says, "It shall be a mark on the hand and on the forehead," it represents a sign to remember forever. Now, as believers celebrating these holidays, it is a privilege to celebrate them, because although we are not part of the physical people of Israel, but still we have the opportunity of celebrating this feast as a memorial regarding the Messiah and his sacrifice. So we should actually be thankful to celebrate this festivity of the Creator. And not only thankful, we should also celebrate this festivity and be waiting for this festivity in joy and preparing ourselves and in our lives to not have in our lives hypocrisy, to not be full of lies, to not be full of things that do not that are not acceptable and that are not grateful towards the Eternal. And well, this is all for today's video. I hope this video was was edifying and helpful for you, just as it was for me. And I hope that you learned from this video, just like I learned from studying these chapters as well. Thank you so much for your time. And in the description down below, there are going to be links of videos that talk about the festivity of Pesach, Matzah, and Bikurim, which are narrated in a much understandable way. So you can check them out and learn from them as well, just as I have learned from them. If you like this video, then please give us a like. And if you have any comments or any questions or any suggestions for any youth themes in English, then you are welcome to write them, or to write them down in the comment section down below. Thank you so much once again, and have a good day. Bye.